Hello and welcome to the third day of SFFCon 2021. Lisa Richmond, and I'll be your moderator for the Space Flight Combat Panel. Many classic space operas draw from the familiar, using tactics from either the Air Force or the Navy. But do these really translate to flight combat in space? That's what we're here to talk about today. We have 3 pilots on our panel. We have an aviation engineer and a Marine. And yes, in case you're wondering, that was capitalized. I said?
Like that, please.
I'm Lisa Richmond. I'm your moderator. I'm one of the 3 pilots and the author of 15 hard science fiction thrillers across 4 different series in 2 different universes. I'm also a NASA brat, so I've been around aviation literally all my life. One of my first memories was seeing the astronauts flying around down in Houston. And with me are Rachel Okus. Did I say that right?
Okus, really close.
Okus.
Yeah.
Rachel Okus, who's another fellow pilot. She has some pretty cool airplanes actually in her hangar.
I'm jealous.
I know. She has Stearman, and it was on the cover of Stearman magazine. Okay, but I digress. She's the author of 30 books across 8 different series, everything from space opera to zombie apocalypse to a set of bounty hunter books that the Mandalorian fans will love. Robert Buick Shores is a retired USAF F-15E WSO with over 370 combat hours flown during Desert Storm. As a fighter weapons school graduate, Buick brings an extensive knowledge of weapons, tactics, and aerial combat maneuvering to his part-time role as a freelance editor of sci-fi books, and he's the kind of guy that makes all of us writers sound like we know what we're talking about. Jonathan Brazzi is a retired USMC infantry colonel and the author of over 50 books, and I don't know exactly how many because I stopped counting after I hit 50. And his books include the new Sentence to War series that's been topping the military sci-fi charts. And S.J. Shower is the author of the soon-to-be re-released Spiral War military space opera series, and it's been picked up by Dawn Runner Press. SJ has a background in aviation engineering and experience with night vision and military weapons systems. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So let's jump right in. Before we get into combat, let's talk about space flight first. What are the differences between atmospheric flight and flying in a near vacuum?
Maneuverability is going to be probably the biggest one, at least with Newtonian physics as we understand them right now. You're not nearly as maneuverable in space as you are in the atmosphere. So, but space battles may not be so exciting if they take weeks to occur. So I think that's where the fiction part comes in. They're a lot more exciting when you can have dogfights in space versus just one quick pass. You got to orbit around a gravity well and then come back for another one.
Man, you mean Star Wars isn't real?
Well,
and those X-wings.
Right?
Yeah, the wings in space alone is always cracks me up. I'm like, you don't need wings because we don't, the 4 forces of aviation. You got your lift, your weight, your drag, and your thrust. When you're flying, they don't apply in a vacuum. So yeah, it's kind of funny when you still see wings used in space.
And there are justifications for wings, but only if you're really talking transatmospheric or you're using them for something other than lifting surfaces.
Like
you're using them to place you're using them someplace to mount your weapons, someplace to mount your engines, someplace to disperse heat. Because heat's a major factor with anything space flight, especially because space as a near vacuum doesn't like to take heat away very easily. So
there's nothing to
radiators are a
transport
huge thing.
There's nothing to transport the heat away.
Exactly.
There's no atmosphere.
Right. And also one of the things you have to factor is, like you said, the 4 forces of flight. You now basically only have thrust and maybe weight, depending on where you are in relation to bodies of mass. So there's no drag.
Yeah, there's gravity everywhere, but it's so minute unless you're around another body that's causing it to impact you.
Right.
Yeah. And I'd say another thing too is speed. You can, within atmospheric flight or on Earth, and everything, speed's relatively limited. Of course, our technology has helped us go a lot faster, but in space, it's only limited by wherever our technology goes in our shielding for the most part, because radiation seems to be the big thing with like going anywhere close to light speed or even a fraction of light speed. The closer you go to it, the more radiation you're going to get. So shielding is one of those crucial things that you're going to need on a spaceship that or a space flight that you don't need in, planetary.
And the faster you go, also the more micrometeorite dusts.
Yeah.
Impacts.
And you also have to account for the fact that any thrust you're going to have to counter. So if you roll, and you fire a 5 Newton thruster, you're going to have to fire that 5 Newtons again in the opposite direction to stop the roll. If you accelerate at 9 Gs for 5 seconds, guess what? When you want to turn around, you're going to have to accelerate that same amount of time just to stop. So, I always appreciate when you do see that accounted for in sci-fi. Maybe they don't do it the best. Maybe they fudge the numbers a little bit just to make it exciting. But when you do see things like thrusters firing, you see reverse retro thrusters firing, you see ships doing a flip and burn, and not just, oh, hi, here we go. Yeah, I'm just making a nice banking turn without some form of explanation as to why they can do that.
I agree. I agree about the fudging. Sometimes you have to fudge, but you got to take it into account at least.
I mean, things like, I did a reading yesterday from my first book, and it is one of the flight scenes, and it's, this bird right here. And I say that, while he's making a turn through a canyon, that these thrusters on the bottom are firing to counter the momentum before he rockets off in the next direction. And I realize I just did that outside of frame. So, because I want it to be as realistic and feel as realistic as possible, while still being fun. Because let's face it, I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm a pilot. I like to imagine myself in those cockpits. And I grew up watching Star Wars and Battlestar and Buck Rogers. And now I look back at them and go, how do you make that work?
Yeah, I see we already got questions and comments coming in on our from the audience. So this is pretty cool. So the one question I see is there radiation when jumping into subspace?
I think it depends on your physics of your universe.
Subspace.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to define how you enter subspace.
Let's define what subspace is.
Yeah, I think we should define that first. And that's based on your universe.
Yeah, in my own books, hyperspace is a higher dimensional universe that exists alongside ours. And as such, if you go into it unprotected, unshielded, bad things are going to happen because you shouldn't exist in there.
I think the real key when I'm looking at somebody's book to edit it is remembering that this is fiction, right? That's the whole part of it, is that they come up with some type of plausible explanation for why things are happening. It doesn't matter if it actually matches our physics or not, but at least it gives something that the reader can grab onto and go, okay, he's accelerating with anti-grav technology, something we don't have. Doesn't mean it can't exist, but at least it gives them some type of accounting for it as opposed to just showing the wings in space on making a tight turn. Or I love Battlestar Galactica with the turbos. Well, what are they compressing? They got an internal engine in there? I'm not sure. They showed a big afterburner coming out the back, and I always think, wow, that's going through a lot of fuel. Where are they holding that? But as long as they account for something, then I'm pretty happy. I'm okay that things don't match up with reality, because again, the whole idea is to make it interesting and fun to read so that the readers can place themselves in that cockpit and experience what those of us have actually flown, feel like they're doing that. And like I said, I think it would be a little boring in space combat, the way we understand physics currently. Which is probably really a poor understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, just the amount of fuel that we would have to, unless we talk nuclear, fusion or fission, and even then, a nuclear fission like the Draco engine, still requires some sort of like hydrogen or something, you know. So it's, but that kind of stuff is boring, you know. So you know, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time.
You know, you could get really into the details, and the hard science techies are going to enjoy it. But unless you've got a story that's exciting with characterization and the storyline, you're probably not going to get a real wide readership.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
I think what Robert said was just right. You have to explain it, even if the explanation is not scientifically possible given today's understanding of science.
At least it stays consistent within your universe.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
It's maintaining that consistency is one of the most important things. You know, I'm able to hand wave away banking and space and Star Wars because that's always what they've done, you know. But when they start doing skid turns and they start doing momentum turns, now you're like, no, now you're breaking your own rules. You know, that's when it kind of gets and bugs me. It's just like, you know, you've already established how you work. Don't break it.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I want to talk now about navigation. We've talked about flight, the difference between atmospheric and space flight. How does navigation in space differ from navigating like what we're used to here on Earth?
I think as the resident navigator here, that's what a WIZO actually is, a navigator rating that has weapons experience. The big difference is up and down. There really is no up and down. Now you can set an artificial plane in space, but you always have to have a point of origin, some place that you're navigating or creating your grid from. And I think that's what is always confusing. I always love watching Star Trek when the Enterprise is orbiting around a planet, and to me it's backwards because they're always belly down, and I'm thinking that's a negative G orbit. So but they have inertial or inertial dampeners on board that cause them to always feel gravity at their feet. So I think the navigation in space would be really challenging, especially for those of us who are used to doing it in, although we call it a three-dimensional world, it really is kind of a two-dimensional world with the exception of climbing or descending. You know, we're right and left, and we always have our north and south poles. Don't have those in space.
And there was something that my dad used to say when I was a kid about it being very counterintuitive to people on Earth, especially orbital insertions, because if you go like you intuitively want to go one direction and it's exactly the opposite. I'm kind of saying what you just said, isn't it?
Well, anybody that's ever watched the NASA channel and you see the orbital path and it's a giant sine wave, just kind of hurts your head because we think of it as just flying a great circle around the planet, and that's not how it actually works, at least not the way we're flying it.
And how you adjust your momentum, especially in orbital planes, really can get confusing. It's like, wait, so to go lower, I go faster? What? You know, and you know, when you're really dealing with orbital mechanics, I actually have a website that I have bookmarked that I'm like, okay, if I'm dealing with orbital mechanics, I got to pull this up and look at this and make sure that I'm not breaking my brain too much. But yeah, when you're talking navigation, I mean, it's one of the things like, you know, we're all familiar with the Star Trek turn to heading 340 Mark 15. And it's like, what is that in reference to? Is that in reference to the planet? Is that in reference to the local star? Is that in relation to, you know, galactic center? Yeah. If it's a relation to galactic center, how do you know where galactic center is just off the top of your head? You would reorient yourself pretty much every time you get someplace and say, okay, unless I'm flying off to another star, that's when I'm using galactic center. But if I'm just navigating around the system, center is going to be the star. You know, that's 0, 0. I remember one time they were saying, you know, like 350 Mark 25. And it's like, sir, that takes us towards the star. It's like, so what's your navigation plane, you know? Because, you have to set it all artificially.
And
Rachel, what were you saying?
Complicate that. So you're talking about, you know, using your navigational beacon of sorts, but the star's moving, the gravitational center is moving. I mean, everything in space is constantly moving. I mean, we're so small that stuff looks like it's always out there, but I mean, it not only is it more complicated, but everything, you know, sun is moving, Earth is moving, every single object in space besides your ship is moving. And then as you go too, your gravitational forces are constantly changing around you. You know, every time you go by a planet, or depending on how close you are to a star, it's all of that is also still screwing with you. And
if you're going a certain speed, you're dealing with relativity.
Yep. And so when you mentioned, I think at the very beginning, the coordinates, you know, you can't use simple GPS coordinates that we use on Earth. They're gonna be many times more numbers involved. And
what you're going to be seeing is that there's going to be a lot more computational procedures being done because of everything being shifted. Like you said, stars are moving at different speeds. The galaxy is moving. You know, the various spiral arms are moving in relationship to others. So the only thing to me that makes sense and what I've used is that you'd have to be taking known points, which may be stars or whatever else, and more than you can do in your brain, you're just going computational. You're using vast amount of computational energy to have a matrix within all of that is constantly changing. So if you're going to Betelgeuse, to one of the planets on Betelgeuse now, well, that's not going to be the same thing as going 10 years from now.
Yeah,
it's like the old.
I think computers.
So it's just, we just get set right now of being on Earth that this is the Earth. You know, we've got GPS satellites, and that's the way it's always going to be. And they're exact. I'm sorry, I got two little girls waving at me. Bye bye. and that's just not going to work. Yeah. It is going to be a constantly changing galaxy.
Yeah.
That's going to have to be taken into account.
Well, I think AI is going to have. Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, you're going to have a lot more automation when it comes to navigation. It's like, I want to fly to this planet. Okay, set your course, and then the AI is going to, the automated systems are going to do the course corrections for you in a lot of the times,
So one of the questions that just came through was, how do you call out bearings of other stellar or planetary bodies in your personal work, in your books? Rachel, how do you do that?
I do. Everything is pretty much automated, even though I have pilots in all of my books because I got to. I can't not have my pilots. Everything is done through automation within the systems. So it's all managed right out there. I do not speak to specific bearings, numbers. I leave that all to the reader's imagination.
There's a concept called the universal specific, which basically means, don't get too detailed, and everyone will kind of buy into it. Mm-hmm. And that really is probably a really good way to handle things like this.
Yeah, I tend to handle it pretty similar to the way Rachel does. If it's the captain ordering the ship somewhere and you're seeing it through the captain's POV, he's not going to know the specific angles, He's going to sit there and say, put us on course towards that gas giant. Put us on course towards the local moon. Keep us behind that moon. Now, if you jump into, say, the navigator's head or the helmsman's head, now they're thinking, okay, I have to adjust our course by this many degrees, by up, down, add this amount of thrust. I know one time, just as an exercise, I was like, hey, I'm doing a story that's set in the Earth system 100 years from now. How do I model what trajectories we're going to take? And it's like, okay, if you want to spend a week running the math for two lines in your book, go right ahead. But if you just want to say, hey, I'm putting this onto this orbit that'll take us to Mars, boom, done. You don't have to put in all that unless you're writing real hard sci-fi. I think back to Ringworld and Niven and, how he was doing all the math. And sitting there saying, to dock with it, you have to be moving at this angular velocity to get onto the docking platform. And one screw up and you're splattered against the side of the thing. So.
Yeah, and if you add science in your book, you better be able to defend it because the readers will.
They will.
They'll find it.
Yeah, I'm lucky. I've got Rob to help catch me on stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rob, as an editor, how often do you have to tell your writers that you work with, step back from the geek and you're losing your audience?
I don't know that I ever say losing the audience. I do point out things that I think will cause the audience to notice and to dislike. Again, you mentioned suspension of belief, right? Or disbelief, however people want to say that. They have to buy into the fact that this is fiction to some degree, but you have to, whatever world you create or environment you create, as was mentioned earlier, I think Jonathan mentioned it, you have to follow those rules, right? And if you don't follow those rules, that's definitely where they get upset. There are always going to be some folks that they want the math, they want everything to be perfect. I think they lose the story. I know that was talked about earlier. The story is the most important thing. If the readers buy into the story, then they will overlook a lot of things because they're involved and they're engaged. But you don't want them to fall out of the story because one minute you're talking about a guy shooting lasers and the next minute he's shooting projectiles. He hasn't changed weapons and you haven't described that maybe this type of weapon can shoot both lasers and projectiles. A lot of the things can be resolved with just one or two lines to explain something versus leaving me going, wait, I thought that was a projectile weapon.
Yeah.
Now I'm falling out of the story because I'm confused. That's the biggest thing that I try and point out to the writers that I work with. I'm a little bit different in that I don't work for a publishing house. I basically only work for a couple of writers that I really like working with. And for me, it's their story. Regardless of what they want or regardless of what I think, I'm just giving them suggestions. Whereas I know I've talked to Rachel about this before. When you sell your story to a publishing house, now they own it. If they say you need to change this to this, then
you don't have a choice.
It gets changed and they lose control. Yeah. So for better or worse, I pretty much just make suggestions and leave it to them to either accept them or not. Sometimes I'm more strenuous with the suggestions. Sometimes it's like either or. You don't need to change it, but you might. Again, I don't get too wrapped around the axle about some of it. One of the things that does kind of bug me though is ricochet. I think even talking about this, ricochet is a projectile type thing, and people talk about lasers ricocheting all over the place. I'm like, they don't ricochet. They bounce, they reflect.
There's a reflect or a refract.
And not everybody gets that, and so there's
I haven't read that. I haven't seen that. That's kind of funny though.
Yeah.
Or physics that we do understand, like, nobody hears you scream in space, right? I don't think that's ever going to change. Like you mentioned, there's sound waves in there. So there are things that can be easily corrected. And some writers have done outstanding jobs. We see the lasers in Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica, and you hear them going by you. We all know that's not really true. Okay, it's great on the big screen because it adds to the reader or the watcher's attention. But
on the other hand,
it's a little bit different.
When Star Wars first came out, all the reviews slammed it for that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But somehow the people watching it.
Well, because it does make it more enjoyable. It's kind of boring if you don't know why the guy is doing what he's doing. One of the writers that I like reading actually addressed it very eloquently in that his onboard sensors on the ship made sounds for him, and actually his visual thing, a synthetic laser going by. And so it only took him less than a paragraph to describe this, and it was perfect.
That's actually good. That's clever.
Yeah, the audio simulators, that's actually one of those things I kind of like because that would be something you'd want as a pilot.
Yeah. It's almost a form of haptic feedback.
We actually have it real world now. We have 3-dimensional earplugs that we'll wear. So we have what's called radar warning receivers, which usually is a display and you hear a beep and you'd look down to find it. Now you get it from whatever direction. So you hear the beep if it's coming off my right wing behind me. We actually have the ability to simulate that right now, real world. And so that helps you immediately know where to look without having to now look down at my display and go, I need to look over.
I'm taking a note right there.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Yeah, so that is awesome.
It's really fun.
That's why he's awesome editor for.
And that's all.
Once upon a time, where fiction and fantasy, like Dick Tracy with his talking watch. My daughter has a watch that she talks to, listens to. Garmin, same thing with flip phones, a communicator from Star Wars. My kid gave me grief when I reluctantly gave up my flip phone for a smartphone. So what we think is or science fiction right now in 10, 15 years may be just commonplace.
Right, exactly. Now, you said something that is a nice segue into switching over from spaceflight to combat, and that is, hearing things coming at you. So let's do that. Let's switch over to combat. When you think of sweeping space battles, several classic authors come to mind. I won't name any of them, but Some of them, as stated earlier, lean into traditional warfare. The first is the naval concept of ships of the line. But does that really translate well to space? And if it does, what are the drawbacks?
I think it depends on the tech level. I mean, if you're talking near future tech, it doesn't. It kind of doesn't in near future tech. But when you're talking a more developed, further future technology where you have multiple levels of ships, it can. But I think one of the things you have to specify is one of scale. Are you doing combat from different orbits? Planetary orbits, above a planet, or stellar orbits. Are you firing at a ship around Earth from Mars, with a half light speed weapon that's going to take 40 minutes to get there? Or are you getting in closer? And why are you getting in closer? What are the technological limitations that are putting you in closer? Is it a matter of you're firing rail guns and you want to make sure you can track those errant shots so you can either self-destruct them or retrieve them? Or is it a matter of you're firing lasers and they're only good for a couple of light minutes? Are you dealing with warp drives or Star Wars hyperdrives where you could jump in and out of anywhere? Or are you dealing with stargates? You're dealing with fixed points in space that have to be protected and defended, natural bottlenecks for moving through hyperspace or whatever system you're using. That really affects the difference in how you do combat. Because if you're, for instance, just defending a gate, well, now you're more focused on short-range weapons. You're focused on high delta V, moving around quickly to get out of the way, as opposed to your Star Trek stuff where fire can be coming from anywhere. And your best defense is stealth, and how effective is stealth in space? Hint, it's really not, without some really high tech going on to hide your heat.
I think the naval battles or Navy fighting, current Navy fighting can be used as a basis, but not really ship of the lines. If you read submarine warfare books, I think that gives you a much better concept of how you can write space battles, because submarines are not spaceships. They do have water to be able to maneuver against, but it is more of a 3D battle space.
Yes, the XYZ plane, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think if you want to write good space battles and it fits your universe, I think it's a good idea to go out and read some of the better submarine books or watch some of the submarine movies that do a better job. So I think you can take the present day Navy and translate that into good space battles.
Just not surface Navy necessarily.
Just not surface Navy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a three-dimensional thing. I do like a lot of the big epic space battles where they do broadsides and stuff like that, because as SJ mentioned, the weaponeering in space is really difficult. Lasers will only go so far, at least with the technology we have now. They do have a dispersal range. Mm-hmm. So even though they may not be attenuated in space, their power per square meter will be decreased over the longer ranges. Projectile weapons, once you set them on a path, they're very easy to avoid unless you're really close, doing a broadside like the old cannons, you're shooting right across. Now, the broadside may be three-dimensional, and you may have multiple ships broadsiding you, depending upon the number of platforms you have. Same thing with missiles. Once their fuel is expended, they become a kinetic. There's no maneuvering because there are no fins and there's no atmosphere to maneuver in. So it doesn't take a lot of change in a delta V or velocity to avoid a type of weapon that can no longer maneuver. And that's why I think quite often you have to get close. But again, it depends on the environment. Some of the writers that I've really enjoyed have the ability to hyper jump in and out. Their weapons have the ability to hyper jump. One had a real nice weapon where they actually basically, I think Stargate used this with the Asgard. They teleported their weapons inside through the shields. Very neat concept. again, it fit within the explanations of the universe they were working in. So I think, again, just goes back to it's got to work within the universe. And I do like the analogy that Jonathan used with subwarfare, because it is very important to add that three-dimensional part of it. Even in flying, it's amazing how much time I had to spend as an instructor teaching guys not to fly two-dimensionally. They would set up, we have what we call turn circles when you're doing BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, and they get to where they fly very flat. And the better dogfighters use the vertical, either to slow themselves down or to add speed or to decrease their turn radius. And it was really hard to get people because we live and we think flat because we walk on the earth. And once you get to flying, you got to kind of ditch that and learn to use three dimensions to your advantage and to the opponent's disadvantage. So
okay, so let's switch over then to comparing space flight from naval to Air Force and dogfights and things like that.
Well, I think it's similar. The advantage we have is we have a little bit more 3D maneuvering other than subs, which obviously have 3D maneuvering, but it's going to be very different. We already talked about the G forces. We have to assume you have some type of inertial dampeners on board the ships. Otherwise, we'd all be splattered jelly on the walls once they started to accelerate, if they had more acceleration than we currently have. Now, what you have to assume, because if you're using chemical engines to accelerate, you can't carry enough fuel and you can't accelerate hard enough. So they need to have some type of anti-gravity or warp drive or subspace or something. So that makes the maneuvering very, very different. I think we still see a lot of dogfightings because it's what we know, right? It's what people are comfortable with. They watch Top Gun. Navy fighter movies, don't watch the Air Force fighter movies. I hate to say that. The Navy does so much better job. And I'm so looking forward to seeing the new movie.
What, you mean Iron Eagle wasn't good?
I cringed just it, jumping from, F-16s with no weapons to tanks to all of a sudden, then he's got a weapon. Then it's like whoever was the technical advisor should have been fired from that movie. It was just horrific.
Well, apparently that's why they had to film it in Israel.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is in that case, the Navy actually supports the movies and the Air Force doesn't want to do with them. And so we get really bad movies, which make us look like idiots.
No technical advisors on there that really know what they're doing. Yeah. When I wrote this, I sent these questions out to the panel for all of you guys who are watching ahead of time. And when I wrote the question, can there be dogfights in space? Can there be fighter pilots in space? Rob wrote back and said, fighter pilots can't exist in space. They need air so they can tell you how great they are.
Well, I like that. That got me a laugh.
That is true. That is true.
It's the same with Navy and Marine Corps pilots. If you're a fighter jock.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to do 2.5 years exchange with the Marine Corps down at EWTG PAC. It was an outstanding assignment. I worked more with the JTACs than the fighter guys, but I did have fighter guys on my crew, so it was a really good time. And it kind of goes with the nature. I mean, I was actually kind of surprised we weren't all arrogant a-holes when I got in there. We actually had guys who were very quiet, unassuming, very religious, and then the entire stream. But confidence is one thing you absolutely have to have, because what idiot would fly into a surface-to-air missile system who's got a much longer range and bigger warhead than you do unless you're extremely confident in your gear and your training? So
there's a difference between confidence and arrogance.
Yeah, one of my good friends was the XO of the Nimitz, I think it was, F-14 pilot. And you meet him, you talk to him, he is the epitome of cool, great guy to talk to, but he's got that confidence that he knows what he wants. He knows he can do it. And he's been very, very successful after retiring because he's got that confidence.
We do have a question. Does anyone know of examples of an author using networked drones in space similar to the Loyal Wingman system being developed by USAF? Actually, I have that in my Biogenesis War series. Do any of you guys have? I have a sphere of drones that, in fact, the co-pilot, that's his job, is to manage the drones. How about you guys?
That's actually something I'm debating bringing in, not this current book, but the next book is something similar to that. But one example I can think of, and it's not a book, okay, it is the Macross anime, where they deal a lot with AI. They don't do it so much in the first one, but in some of the follow-on series, They deal a lot more with drones in a loyal wingman type configuration, where they're there protecting the human piloted craft, and following orders and going after what they're, going after objectives. So
in my universe, they actually extend. They extend the sensor range of the ship. They extend the capabilities of the ship. There are different types and classes of drones that can be used for different purposes, such as ECM and even deploying missiles and things like that. So there's all sorts of ways you can use drones. Do any of you other guys use that kind of stuff?
Not in space fighting. In ground fighting, yes.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Rachel?
Not in combat. I only use them as little pickup drones because, of course, my last book they were garbage collectors, so drones came in handy. But no, I like the idea of using them as part of a network matrix for combat.
Yeah, but actually, I did used to work with drones. That was the program I worked on longest when I was at Edwards Air Force Base. I worked on the Global Hawk and pretty much anything that the Air Force flew that was a drone. So there's a lot of stuff I know about drones that I'm like, yeah, drones are cool. Drones have drawbacks.
Yeah, they do.
They have serious drawbacks, especially when you're talking combat systems. So, and that was something that when I was my last job there with Afotech, the operational test division, the colonel and I would sit down and we'd have hours-long discussions about how drones for combat would have to be designed and made, and how they would what links they would have to use specifically, because of jamming was one of the big concerns.
Yeah. Okay, so that is a good segue into a question that I can't say this name. Hobie64 asked on YouTube, which is, have you ever been a few books into your series and wished you had set up your science or your tech in your universe differently?
All the time. By the time I get to book 8, I'm thinking, wow, I really wish I had done it in book 1.
Yeah.
Of course, you can always evolve your science or your tech, but sometimes, if you set your rules in your universe a certain way, you're kind of married to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons why with my science and tech, as much as I try and keep it real, I also try and not dive into it too deeply. Because as our knowledge of science increases, you might write that here's how a plasma engine works, and very specifically getting down to the nitty gritty. And then 2 years from now, somebody actually develops a plasma engine and it works completely differently. So I'll throw in concepts of how things work and say, hey, here's how this works on a broad scale. But I won't get into the nitty gritty, because if I know if I do that, somebody's going to discover something in science and prove me wrong. And then I'll just get people going, oh, you're wrong. It's like,
or science and current knowledge is going to catch up to you, and there are reasons why, there's some good arguments for staying vague in science fiction.
Yeah, because China's new ion engine,
develop a warp engine, so one will be developed soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just have to find some very exotic particles and nobody knows where they are.
Unobtainium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. I've got another question here. Let's see. So did we really talk enough about dogfights in space and how they can or cannot happen?
Well, I think Robert said that, the readers expect dogfights. And in my Fire Ant series, which is my space combat series, she was a fighter pilot. So obviously I think you can do it. But now she also, when she was in space, in deep space or whatever, it was the long looping things. It wasn't really dogfighting per se, but the WASP aircraft, spacecraft, could also go into the atmosphere. And so I had several times where they're basically, because you can maneuver in an atmosphere, because you got a planet to rotate around, a lot of times you would dive from space into the atmosphere to give yourself an advantage. And And so how realistic all of that is, I've had, 1,000 reviews, I guess, and only one has ever said, has ever called me out on a science fact. And I think they're wrong. I sent it to a physicist I know to see if I was really that wrong. But obviously and I remember I'm writing fiction. I'm not writing, real life. So yes, my answer is yes, you can write about fighter pilots in space.
Yeah. Well, and there's, again, as I said before, it's a matter of scale. If your combat is all in high or low orbit, fighter pilots may be dipping down into the atmosphere to hit objectives, because maybe you don't want to hit it with the main cannon of your ship, because that could have the result of causing massive earthquakes that destroy the planet. So you want to do some precision strikes that, let's face it, a precision strike is going to be easier the closer you are to the target, Now, I know some bomber buddies who would argue BS on that, because had I not been medically discharged from my Air Force cadet time, my plan was to fly A-10s. And he's like, plane. Oh, we could do close air support with B-52s now. And I'm like, no, yes, I acknowledge we have laser weapons that can guide in a bomb from 50,000 feet. However, that requires somebody holding a laser on something or properly designating a target. And that's a lot different than a dude with a 30 millimeter machine cannon blowing up a tank. And that's eminently more satisfying.
There are authors like Jack Campbell and his Lost Fleet series.
Naval Academy.
What's that? Yes.
Naval Academy.
Jack Henry.
Mm-hmm. Good friend of
Jack
mine.
Henry. He writes, he has the universe that has the gates that are established at at certain points in each solar system. And so his engagements, number one, he talks about light lag, because, you've got the enemy fleet coming at you and they're going to be so far away that light lag does come into effect. He also talks about once they're closing, they're closing at such speeds that the actual engagement is almost over before it began, and it's things like that people who are writing science fiction combat need to keep in mind.
I think John does about the best job of any of the writers who write about space combat, in my opinion.
From that kind of scale, not the dogfight scale, but the large scale.
Yes, not dogfights, but the big ships, the big spaceships fighting.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about willing suspension of disbelief and how that, how far you lean into that in combat, in space combat.
I guess I always try to find something that's in the middle between Star Wars and NASA.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if I need technology to explain something, that's the awesome thing about science fiction is I can make up some cool sounding tech. It worked for Star Trek, and I have fun with it. So.
Yeah, it's all about how you sell it. How do you sell the idea of how this technology works? If you sell it well and your reader can sit there and say, yes, that works, they're willing to go along with it. If you give a really half-hearted, oh, well, hand wave, it's, no, and especially it also depends on how much you've engaged the reader outside of that. If they're really engaged with the characters, they're really engaged with the story, they're willing to suspend disbelief more than if they're just kind of like, yeah, I don't care about these characters. I'm just here for the combat, and the combat doesn't work for me.
One of my favorite scenes where you kind of talk about this is Star Wars. The Millennium Falcon runs into an asteroid field and they disappear into an asteroid into the mouth of a giant space moray eel. And what gets me about that whole thing, and my daughter gives me grief about this, is they fly out and I'm like, so what in the world is that eel eating out there in the middle of space? And how is there oxygen inside that guy's mouth? And my daughter would be like, that's the part you find hard to believe. I'm like, well, yeah. I go, he was so bad he couldn't even swallow something that flew into his mouth. How did he get so big, and how's he living? So
yeah,
you have to fiction. That's the great part about fiction. You're supposed to disappear, right? You're supposed to be willingly to give up your belief in the systems, to believe this new universe that's been created.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to do it, or you're never going to be a fiction reader who enjoys what they read.
Yeah. Well, I know that's one of the things that I had to really explain in my first book was the asteroid shell that their academy is in, and right. If I had thought about it a little bit more, I would have placed it instead in a ring system of a gas giant, because then I can get this massive amount of rocks and debris and garbage, as opposed to your Star Wars level asteroid field that they don't quite exist in the universe, not unless something just went kablooey.
Space is really, really, really vast.
Yes.
And there's a whole lot of nothing in between point A and point B, and there's not a whole lot to hide behind. Esther, you mentioned earlier stealth. Let's talk about stealth for a little bit. What could you use to hide a ship's arrival in enemy territory?
I rely a lot on stealth technology, because if we are projecting weapons that are so powerful, then if there is no countermeasures, then the book is just going to be, oh, shit went out, got blown up in the book. Sorry, the MC's dead. You have to have countermeasures, and so I don't get a lot into it. Well, with individual soldiers on Marines or soldiers on the ground, I actually do go into the science of the stealth. With the spaceships, it is sort of, yep, it's stealthy, and there's always limitations to that. It's not perfect, but if you're going to have ships survive with massive weapons firing all over the place, there's got to be some countermeasures, or else it's just not, the book's not going to work.
With my stuff and stealth, not to step on you, John, it is a tech level where there are shields. There are shields for protection. There are defensive weapon systems for protection, much like what you have with CWIS and RAM, my first job out of college, and decoys and all that kind of thing. But when it comes to something that is a stealth ship, that is a very specialized piece of hardware. That is something that is trying to put out the minimum amount of emissions, that is trying to block or deflect the maximum amount of sensor pings that could be hitting its hull. And the biggest one, and this is the one that I try and focus on, because this is the one that most people don't think about and is the real killer, is heat. How do you get rid of the heat? So, how do you blend into the background heat? And I have these basically very specialized heat sinks, and every ship has them, because there's certain times that in combat, even the big ships, they have to dump into the heat sinks because they can't expel the heat as well as they could in cruising flight. Fighters do this especially too, and with stealth ships, that's the real big thing, is they're basically giant heat sinks. 3/4 of the ship is a heat sink to basically store all this heat until they can get someplace where they're out of view.
Dump heat eggs.
Right. Yeah. Where basically until they can get to a point where they know they're not being seen on sensors, and they could just now dump all their heat. Yeah. So it's easier.
It would be easier if, say, you were entering like Proxima Centauri's area, because that's such a very active red dwarf that you could time it with a CME or a solar flare or something like that, and that would just the noise that would mask an arrival.
Right.
One of the things that, not so much on stealth, but talking about heat, one of the things that I'm kind of proud of is in my Fire Ant series, when the fighters, as they're building up heat, is that was transferred into a billet, which is now used as a kinetic weapon. So you're basically firing like a depleted uranium round or something like that, but it's superheated, not so much because it's needed for the weapon, it's to get rid of the heat.
That's actually not a bad idea. I like that.
That's the one cool thing I think I have in that series.
Well, it's actually not a bad idea when you think about it, because a railgun would generate a ton of heat. So while you're building up all this heat and you're dumping the heat into the second round, first round's a cold round, second round's a hot round.
Well, that's exactly how hellfire works and penetrates 6 inches of steel. Is after it detonates, it basically liquefies its charge and burns through. So it happens almost instantaneously. So it's a very good technological use of the two things. Create a more efficient weapon, and you've solved the heat transfer problem. It's good.
Another thing that I think might actually come into play in the future is intelligence and counterintelligence, and stealing we have we use transponders as pilots, and so I've got an ADSB that will tell me exactly what tail number of every plane in proximity to me as I'm flying is, and there's gonna be something like that out there. So steal someone else's tail number, hack in there, and just that would be another way to sneak in.
I use that. Well, not the tail number, but I use changing
the concept.
Who people who catch you are going to think you're somebody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a similar sensor masking system where you adjust the energy output of your ship to look like something else, and then like a holographic cloak that'll activate at shorter ranges. But it's a very energy intensive system. Yeah,
that's a decoy.
Or decoys that do the same thing. Yeah.
And Dale says if your rounds are hot enough, it could look like a tracer. And that's something that I wanted to bring up. Would you use tracer rounds in space, or would you have taggers or trackers or something? Because I would imagine cleanup after an engagement is going to be really, really important.
I think that's actually something I mentioned in at least one of my books, where they're saying, they have little tracers in the kinetic rounds, so they can go out and pick them up, or they have self-destruct devices that'll melt them down or explode them, so that if they do hit something, it's less damaging.
Newton's third law just sucks, doesn't it? Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, most of the time I've noticed that's just never addressed. Several authors I really like use kinetic weapons, large kinetic weapons. They miss, they never address what happens to them. And as we all know, they just keep going till they eventually hit something or get sucked into a gravity well. So we have that problem right now with our own space program. There's so much debris up floating around, and NASA has to track all of it, because even a 1/4-inch bolt at the speeds it's moving will rip through any of the spaceships that we have currently, because we have no type of shielding that is strong enough to withstand that. So we need to clean up our own atmosphere. It's not an easy problem.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the tech that that's going to be developed soon is going to be for that. We're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, because it's one of those things like you'll see in some sci-fi where they'll deal with micrometeorites puncturing a hole, and they're like, oh, we got to deal with this. And with military space opera, you do have that opportunity of, okay, we're just cruising along, and now suddenly, boom, something hits us. Like, what the heck? And you do the failure analysis after reports that, yeah, this thing got fired 150 years ago. And it just now got us. We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Well, we are reaching the end of our hour for this session. Thank you guys so much for being part of this panel, and thank you all who are watching for asking some really amazing questions. We really appreciate your participation. Let's give you guys a chance to tell our viewers where they can find your books and where they can connect with you. Rachel, would you start?
Sure. Okay. You can find me at www.rachelaucus.com, all one word. And I'm also on Amazon, Wattpad, a few other spots, but those are the main ones. And latest releases just less than 2 weeks ago, launched a new series, Space Adventure, with Jamie McFarland. It's the Space Trooper series. So if you like Starship Troopers, just a little bit more space-based. And of course, the character I chose to write on is spend a lot of time on spaceships. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. And then you'll see a space junk series. You know, we kept talking about all this crap out in space. That I've got a series coming out later this year on called Space Junk.
Awesome. SJ.
Cool. You can find me right now on the socials, Facebook mostly, and spiralwar.com. Watch out for the Spiral War series to make its relaunch this fall. Really looking forward to that. The relaunch concluding with the release of book 6 of the Spiral War series.
Very cool. Jonathan.
You can find me at jonathanbrazy.com, or you can find me at Jonathan Brazy on Facebook. The book that I was talking about, the whole Fire Ant series, that is free right now on Amazon and Wide, and the rest of the books in the series are 99 cents, and that goes until Friday or sometime.
It goes for a week or so.
Yeah.
Awesome. And Rob, did you want to?
The only thing I can say is we've got a book coming out. The other author I edit for is Luke Mitchell. We've got Spoils of War coming out in the end of July on Kindle. So it's the third book in his Excalibur series. It's kind of a neat take on Excalibur and the Round Table, but in a sci-fi genre. So it's kind of interesting.
Oh, that'd be
Awesome.
cool.
I should say, by the way, the book Fire Ant that I talked about, that was a Nebula finalist for Best Novella.
Oh, good.
In 2018.
Nice. Excellent. And you can reach me at biogenesis4.com or facebook.com/LLRichman. All of my books, ebooks are available exclusively on Amazon. The print books are wide, so you can go to Barnes & Noble and order them. And the trilogy, the main trilogy just completed. And I've got another couple of books. I've got a thriller that's coming out here soon that's going to be a little closer to modern day, and then another biogenesis book that's launching late July. Thank you guys so much for your time and for this fascinating conversation. It was a blast, and I'm going to turn it over to James.